Hello YouTube, Phil here. This week I wanted to talk to you guys about how I use metric modulation in my music, but it turns out there aren't really that many resources on YouTube for learning metric modulation properly. Most of them are just drum videos, and a lot of them don't go into the theory of how it works on a larger scale. They just go through sort of examples. So for today's video, I'm just going to go over how metric modulation works, how you can calculate the tempo differences, and how you could tap it out yourself and compose with it. So before we get started, I'd like to define two terms that I'm going to be using in this video. The first one is rhythmic value, and the second one is duration. So what's a rhythmic value? A rhythmic value, for the purposes of this video, is any kind of symbol used to demonstrate how long a note is within a tempo. It doesn't tell you how long the note actually is, it just tells you how many beats it takes up. So for example, a quarter note is 1 beat, that's a rhythmic value. A half note is 2 beats, that's a rhythmic value. Quarter note triplet, eighth note triplet, eighth note quintuplet, these are all rhythmic values, not durations. Now a duration is just an amount of time, and that's independent of what the rhythmic value is. So you could have a duration, for example, 1 second would be a half note in 120 beats per minute, or a quarter note in 60 beats per minute. And both of those, even though they are different rhythmic values, are the same duration. So what is metric modulation then? Metric modulation basically is changing from one tempo to another while keeping a common duration between the two. But since the duration is the same but the tempos are different, the rhythmic value must change. Just like the example that I just gave with 60 beats per minute, a quarter note equaling 1 second, and 120 beats per minute, 1 second being a half note. Likewise, you're going to have two different notes in two different tempos, or two different rhythmic values in two different tempos, which end up equaling the same duration. And that duration makes a link between the two. So let's get right to some examples. In these examples, my left hand is going to be tapping the beat. My right hand is going to be indicating what the meter is. So in a 4/4, I'll be going. And I'm going to speak the rhythms. So ta 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 ta. So allow me to demonstrate the first example, seen below. Ta 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 ta. So that was a pretty simple example. What I did was I took the eighth note, the dotted eighth note, and made it equal to the quarter note in the next tempo. And that's the most common way that you're going to have metric modulations, because generally you take one rhythmic value in the old tempo and make it the actual pulse of the new tempo, because that's the easiest way to ease yourself into a new tempo. That also shows sort of the purpose of doing this, is it makes sort of a smooth transition so that you could just slide into a new tempo without anyone really realizing that you actually changed tempos. So how did I figure out how to calculate that the first tempo was 60 beats per minute and the second one was 80? Well, using this formula. As you can see, it's a basic ratio thing where you do old rhythmic value divided by new rhythmic value, and you do the same sort of ratio on the tempo side. So the old tempo of 60 beats per minute divided by the new tempo, which is X in this case. And then here, you can see all of the calculations that are done to figure out what the actual new tempo will be. This is really useful if you're actually composing these things and you don't want to just sort of tap it out yourself and try and guess your way into figuring out what tempo it is, which can be tricky. Now you know exactly what the tempo is supposed to be. So let's try another one. In this one, the quarter note triplet ends up becoming the quarter note of the next tempo. So you start out in 80 beats per minute, and then if you do the calculations, you know that there's a ratio of 2 to 3 between a quarter note triplet and a quarter, right? So then there's got to be a ratio of 2 to 3 between 80 beats per minute and X. So X ends up being 120. That's a pretty simple calculation that you can do with your head. As with all of the examples that I'm giving today, they're simple enough that you can just do it in your head. So I'm going to demonstrate that for you right now. By the way, don't worry if the metronome speed that I'm starting at isn't exactly 80 beats per minute, or last time if I didn't actually start at 60. I'm just sort of estimating. Here we go. Ta, 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 ta. Obviously I added a bar at the end there. And like before, damn it, this is confusing. Here are the calculations. I'm going to do a slightly more complex one. In this case, instead of using a simple rhythm to start with, like a dotted eighth note or a quarter note triplet, I'm going to be using 5 quarter notes in the space of 3 quarter notes. So this is a slightly more complicated rhythm to count, and so it's harder to sort of get the tempos exactly right between one and the next. But it's a good one to practice because it can still be useful. I've actually used this one in my music myself, so I will be demonstrating that next week. So here goes. Ta 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 ta. As you can see, the transition between those two tempos is really smooth, even though the rhythm that I started off with was a bit strange in comparison to the original tempo. It ended up fitting in well into the second tempo, so it ended up being almost less strange in the end because of the metric modulation. And as usual, here is the calculation. I'm giving you time to read it. So that's that for this week. It's just a little brief introduction into metric modulation. Next week, I'll be covering the difference between metric modulation like we've been doing it now, where you actually change tempos literally by writing out a new tempo, and the difference between that and implied metric modulation, where the musicians that are playing it are hearing everything in the original tempo at all times, but what they're playing sounds like it's in a new tempo. That's more typical of jazz music, but you could also use it in a written out context if you're changing tempos very rapidly or in a way that it would be really complicated to write out. So actually what's written, the meter that's written, isn't the one that actually it sounds like it's in. I've got an example of that in my percussion sextet, which I will be talking about in a few weeks from now, whenever we get around to it.